Welcome to the Steady On podcast, where God's hard truth meets your hard story. I don't need to tell you that life gets hard. Life gets hard, really hard. But God's faithfulness is still active and alive in our hard. And these episodes are dedicated to remembering and claiming the promises of a faithful God. I'm your host, Angie Bauman. I'm a pastor and Bible teacher, founder of Steady On Ministries, and creator of the Step-by-Step Bible Study Method. But more than that, I'm a trauma and abuse survivor who carried a heavy weight of shame and worthlessness for many years. And I still struggle, but I live in much more freedom now because I know God through His Word and speak truth to the lies of the enemy with His Word. And that's what we do here. On Mondays, we take it in by studying the promises of God. And on Wednesdays, we live it out with teaching and testimony on the promises of God. So thank you for tuning in, my friend. You are the reason for this show. And I'm so very, very glad you are here. Let's get started. Hello there, friend. I'm so glad you're here for episode 142, The Other Side of Hope, with me and my special guest today, author, justice advocate, peacemaker, speaker, and podcaster, Danielle Strickland. I first heard Danielle speak in the summer of 2016 at the Global Leadership Summit. The whole conference was a wonderful event, but the highlight for me, undoubtedly, was listening to Danielle preach the Word of God. I'd heard other women preach before, sure, but I'd never seen a woman on that large of a stage carry herself with such confidence. And if you fast forward 3 years of my life later, I had the amazing opportunity to, along with about 40 other women, be a student of Danielle's for an intensive training on speaking and preaching. And the one thing that I've learned about Danielle is that she doesn't shy away from hard. She involves herself in hard, boots-on-the-ground ministry, often reaching out to the poor, the addicted, and the trafficked with the hope of Jesus Christ. She is an example of our verse for this episode, Psalm 71:14. Hear it in the NIV. As for me, I will always have hope. I will praise you more and more. It is a dark, scary world out there, but it can also be a world of love and beauty and hope. Danielle will share how she focuses on the hope, and I believe you will feel the invitation to focus on that hope too. Let's listen in. Hello, and welcome to the Steady On podcast, where we take in and live out the promises of God. I'm Angie Bauman, and with me today is a very special guest, someone that I have admired and followed and learned from for a long time. Not forever, because we're not old, right? But Danielle Strickland.
Yeah, keep hope alive.
Danielle, welcome to the Steady On community.
Hey, thanks, Angie. It's great to be here.
Will you start us off by just giving a little bit of your background and how God really got a hold of you and called you into the kind of work that you're doing now?
Yeah, so it's kind of complicated. And that's really this book, The Other Side of Hope. The first 5 chapters are kind of just autobiographical, starting with my parents coming out of poverty and a lot of dysfunction and trauma. And then also just kind of how that pain of sexual abuse in my early childhood and all kinds of other maybe confusing ideas about God and religion propelled me into a dangerous, horrible journey of drug abuse and rebellion and crime. And in a jail cell just before my 18th birthday, which is the grace of God here in Canada, you kind of stay in this juvenile system. I had a visit in the jail from a Salvation Army lady who was a pastor and a part of my parents' church. And she didn't bring any lectures or any of the normal sort of things I had come to expect of religious people. She just passed me a lawyer's card. She wrapped her arms around me, whispered in my ear, "I love you." When she left, I was unreceptive to that love. She left. I shouted out after her, "You didn't even bring me a smoke." Completely ingrateful. And I remember the door sort of shutting and me being alone in that cell, and Jesus showed up. And I still don't really know how to describe it. It feels otherworldly even to this day, but just had a tangible experience with the presence of Christ where he did the same thing she had done. He wrapped his arms around me, whispered in my ear, "I love you." Mm-hmm. And what happened in that space was not a magical Disney turnaround. It was a long journey out of addiction. But what did happen is someone flipped a light on is how I usually describe it. And I could see for the first time, like the deadness inside of me and the blindness kind of came off. And I saw for the first time and cared for the first time that I was in jail. And probably this isn't a good way to spend my life. And awoke, just sort of awoke that maybe God loved me and was for me and it might matter and it could change the trajectory of my life. So, and then I went on a mission trip. I got special permission from my probation officer to go on this mission trip to Africa, and was in trouble the whole mission trip long. I mean, I was the worst.
They were sorry. They said yes.
Yeah. Oh, I can only imagine. Every day I got like a work thing on free time. I mean, it was unbelievable. But while I was there, I accidentally led someone to Jesus. And with what I call the world's worst gospel presentation, I kid you not. And I had another, almost a secondary awakening, I would say, where I realized I knew God could save anyone because he saved me. But on that day, I realized God could use me to help save someone. And then I didn't change speeds, my mother said. I just changed directions. And I was like, I want to do that with the rest of my life. And that kind of led eventually into me joining the Salvation Army as an ordained minister with them and doing all kinds of projects around the world. And it led me to a lot of justice work. And then in these days led me to a lot of nonprofit startups and just like try to help people as best I can.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Thank you for sharing that background with us. I've been fascinated by your story. I love just your honesty around the fact that that Jesus found me. I found Jesus, however we want to say that, right? Like when I wasn't even very interested in my life being different. It was not in a good place and I didn't really know that I cared. And I think that's just, I appreciate the honesty around that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
I've heard you say that a lot of us don't have lives. We don't have lives with a framework strong enough to display hope to the world. And I'm wondering if you would speak to that just a little bit. What kind of experiences lead you to that understanding? And what do you think we need to do so we do have a framework to display hope to the world?
Yeah, great question. So the other side of hope is a flip book. And on one side is this picture, kind of a dark picture, but with a flower theme. There's a story in there about flower. Actually, it's worth reading. One of my favorites. And then you flip the book over, and the other side of the book is like a frame of the art picture. My experience in hope is that oftentimes we want hope to be a glorious display, and we don't really think about where it shows up. And I got inspired. I was on a trip with an artist friend of mine who really wanted to check out the special art gallery. I was in South Africa. We drove an hour and a half out of our way to get to the special gallery that featured her favorite artist. And when we got there, the art curator had decided to do a thing called the flip side. And what he had done is he'd taken every piece of art in the gallery and flipped it over. So all you could see were the backside of all this art. And my friend I remember she was so mad. She was furious.
I would think they all probably looked very much the same then.
Well, and that's exactly it. I was intrigued because I was like, look, it doesn't matter what kind of artist, how gifted. I mean, my kid could have drawn something on the other side of that art, and the backside would look the same. Yeah. It would look super ordinary, but it would look solid enough. It would have wood that was nailed together, and it would be solid enough to hang a piece of art on. And that's really where, when I was thinking about hope as this glorious display, I was thinking of that art gallery all those years ago and thinking, oh yeah, like hope just isn't just displayed on nothing. It's displayed on our lives. It's displayed in our real stories and our interactions in everyday life, which actually need to have a framework to hold it on. So that's really what I was thinking about. And I share in the theory part of the book some of the things I've learned over the years, things about like true humility, coming into agreement about who you are, things about true dependency, coming into agreement about who God is and trying to get those things right. Ideas of theology, the ways we think about God and interact with God, that I think have really spread what I would call a theology of despair instead of a theology of hope. And then I talk about a rule of life, a way of life that I practice on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, some rhythms. Those are all available for everybody for free. But just like I use postures, surrender, generosity, and mission every day, a real genuine connect and authentic, confess your sin, sort of be your real self once a week with a fellow traveler. And then once a month, really try to get intentional about serving, getting outside of myself and being missionally minded. So that practice itself has created a foundation in my life. And what I've noticed is as I practice that, not just talk about it, there's different things. As I practice it, hope hope shows up everywhere all the time. I've never been more hopeful, which is weird because it's never been crazier in the world. And I've never been more full of hope.
Yeah.
And I think it's that foundational practice that makes a difference.
Yeah. I think it was when I was at boot camp with you in 2019 when we were in Chicago that I first heard this idea. Everything I do, when I write, when I speak, when I sign off, I always close with peace. And I think it's because that's the thing that for me, Danielle, I most long for and has been the most elusive thing in my life, like to be at peace. But when we were in Chicago, I think you said that maybe in a little bit different way, but you talked about how coming into agreement with who God says he is and who he says I am in him, right? And for me, when I'm describing, that's when I'm at peace. If I have anxiety, if I have fallen out of peace, or if I don't have hope, because I would say those two things go very much together, it is because something in me is believing a lie. It's believing a lie of the enemy, or if it's decided that God's promises aren't worth standing on, or he's not enough, or something like that. And it calls me back all the time, that idea of where am I right now? Either not agreeing with God about who he says he is, or who he says I am in him.
Right.
Yeah.
That's great. And I call that living from a shalom center.
Yes.
And that shalom, which is peace, but it's wholeness, it's fullness. And one of the things about the shalom center that I've come to also really appreciate, and this is that final tagline, sort of the subtitle of the book, which is Rediscovering Our Humanity, is I think Lisa Sharon Harper in her book, The Very Good Gospel, breaks this down from a biblical perspective, but how the shalom, which is the perfection of the created order, is not every individual thing being made perfect, but the way every individual thing relates to every other thing being made perfect. So it's the interconnectedness that is perfection, not the individualness that is perfection. And I remember reading that, as you read that, even when you read through Paul, the ministries of reconciliation, and that we would be made one, and all the emphasis on this like interconnectedness, even with creation and us and how we relate to each other, you start realizing, oh yeah, see, like I think even about peace, and I think about hope, we have this such an individualized idea of our faith that we think it's ours to have, that we should have, and we don't realize that actual true peace and hope is this living thing that happens in our connectedness with God and with each other. And that's one of the things I've really come to appreciate about what these idealized versions of promises or truths from the scripture from an individual perspective versus this interconnectedness and this deep honesty about what's really happening and our deep need for each other. So one of my things in this book, for example, is I just say like, hope is not happy. It's honest. Yeah. And that's different.
It is
like
different.
We've been taught that hope is happy. And so as a result of that, if our life isn't happy, and if our life doesn't look good or doesn't look ideal, we think somehow we're failing hope or we're not being hopeful. And I'm always like, that is the opposite of what I've discovered. I've discovered that hope is relentlessly honest. And sorrow, the other misconception we have is that we've thought that sorrow equals despair. So we've avoided sorrow like crazy because we think it's despairing to be sad. And I'm always like, it's not despairing to be sad. Being sad is a part of what it means to be human. And there's a lot to be sorrowful about in this season and to really lament it. But the thing is, and this is where hope is so profoundly powerful, is when you discover that God is at work and you find him in your sorrow. That is the hope that is relentless. That is that determined hope that now God is at work everywhere. You could kind of say with the psalmist, like, where can I even go?
Yes.
And escape your spirit? Absolutely nowhere. God is at work everywhere.
Hey friend, I'm jumping in right here to let you know I'm currently accepting applications for the Steady On internship program. I will be bringing on new team members for the step-by-step Bible study, podcasting, newsletters, and the ministry co-op membership group. If you are a woman who desires to grow your expertise in speaking, writing, and ministry leading, a year-long internship with Steady On may be the next right step for you. During your internship, I will help you build skills to grow your ministry as you support me in mine. Details and a link to the internship application are in today's show notes. If you're even a tiny bit interested, I would absolutely love to talk to you more. And now, back to the show. I think the strongest testimony is this is really hard and I believe God is good, right? Like this is where I am is really hard, or this season is hard, or what I'm seeing is hard, what I'm experiencing is hard. It brings me pain. I am grieving. And I choose to believe that God is working in it and he is good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually, I think I would define hope these days as this relentless belief that God is at work in the world.
Yes. Amen. Yeah.
Wherever we are.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Well, you talk about cynicism and despair and how those are things that I don't want to put words in your mouth, but those are things, the obstacles to hope. Would that be a way to say that? How do you describe it? I think I know what cynicism and despair is, but when I think in relationship to hope, how would you define those things? What do those obstacles look like for us?
Yeah, I think cynicism for me, at least, is the loss of hope in other people.
Mm.
And what I think in the book, I suggest that it's actually the loss of hope in ourselves that then gets projected onto the loss of hope in other people. So cynicism, by definition, is the belief that every other person is out for themselves. That self-serving is behind every action. Now, some of that's just wisdom sometimes, isn't it? That's where it gets really, where it gets really confusing.
Is this
sometimes.
discernment, or is this just like a distrust in humanity in general, right? Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but the loss of faith in other people and the loss of faith in ourselves, of course, eventually leads to despair, which is the loss of hope in anything. And it's a genuine giving over to a despairing or to a hopeless future, which I think, we're in. We're in an age of cynicism and despair. I would suggest that this isn't even just like a threat coming at us. This is like an age we're in right now. So, and again, taking some of the pressure off of ourselves to be people that we're not helps a little bit in rediscovering the hope of who we actually are. And that's that backside of hope, that ordinary framework of our everyday lives, gives us permission to be human and to rediscover that we're okay. We're enough. We're enough for who we are and how God's made us and how we need each other. That's part of what it means to be hopeful, to be able to be interconnected with other people.
So how do we maybe protect ourselves from that in this world that we're living in? And I think that you're so right. Like that it's very hard to be hopeful in other people and in humanity. How do we, as Christ followers, how do we do that? How do we live differently?
Yeah, I think a couple things. I mean, I wrote a whole book on it, so there's a lot.
So get the book. There's that. Yeah.
A couple things. Like one is, and hope. So hope is eternal. Paul told us this, right? There's only three things that will last forever, and it's faith, hope, and love. So hope is, I believe, the presence of God in the world. That's why hope is so potent and powerful. When people touch it, even if they don't know God, but they touch hope, something divine, they're like, whoa, what is this? What is this powerful thing? And I think what Christians can do is say, oh, that's God. You're touching something divine. This is sacred. This is good. And so hope is, because it's eternal, it's constantly present. It's present tense. In other words, what we want hope to be all the time, and I don't know if it's Hallmark's fault or Disney's, I'm not sure, but we want hope to be this thing that we capture and then we take and we have it
and keep it. And yes,
and keep it and pet it. And like, we have hope now, like, or it's like, there's hope, or our hope is on like our past or what we hope for the future, our hope is on, but actually hope, if it's a quality of the eternal presence of God, which I believe it is, then hope is always constant. It's present. It's for now. Hope is for now. So one of the takeaways of this is that cynicism and despair live on the sidelines. If you want to be cynical, just spectate. It'll grow there. Trust me. You don't have to do anything at all to be cynical or to be despairing. Just sit there and watch. Because if you're not participating, if you're not actually active in the present moment, the activity in the present, the participation of this present moment is where hope lives. God is present. I am that I am, always eternally present. That's why today is always the day of salvation. And now is always the time to get for the kingdom, right? Because he's eternally present. So that's one principle in my life, is stop spectating. When you find yourself spectating and watching from the sidelines and just growing in cynicism, then enter in, move into participation with God or whatever it is. So this could be like, I have an NGO that I know that I get really cynical about, what kind of money do they spend on those offices? Like, I'll just get really cynical. And then I'll participate in helping my friend at the food bank and a newcomer to Canada gets settled through this NGO. And by the time I'm halfway through that conversation, even with that person, I'm pretty hopeful about the work this NGO does in this situation. So again, that's just like a real practical, but that happens in everything. It happens with my prayer life. If I just think about prayer, I get pretty cynical. Does it matter? Does it make a difference? Does it do anything? Then if I pray, about halfway through my prayer time, I'm like, whoa,
This is different than I thought. Yeah.
Yeah, this is meaningful.
My
This
husband and I
matters.
call that when it sits in your living room, what you're talking about, like with the NGO, because it's easy to think while it's out there, while you sit, on the sidelines. But when you invite it or unintentionally, it comes and sits in your living room, my husband and I say, then it changes your perspective on everything. And you see, it has a humanness to it that maybe it didn't have before. Yeah. Yeah.
I think the other thing is to get honest, and to not be driven by this idea of hope being happy. So if you're acquainted with any recovery circles at all, one of the things they'll ask in recovery is, does anybody want to share their experience and hope? So that's always fascinating to me to hear, because when they get up to speak, they speak of all these things that you really shouldn't say. They tell the truth, right? About their own life and their own darkness and their own lament and their own sorrow and their own inabilities. And somehow in that really courageous sharing of the truth, hope is present.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think, again, this is evidence that God is everywhere truth is. That there is like the presence of hopefulness. And you would think that somebody sharing their deepest, darkest past would be despairing. But it turns out that it's not despairing, it's hope-filled.
Right.
And I think that's because it's relentlessly honest.
Yes, honesty. I think that also breaks down some of the isolation that we feel when we don't share our stories. We feel like maybe our story is the worst, or our story is the hardest, or our story is the only one like that. But then when other people share their experiences and we see in them, we're like, well, they're doing it, right? Whatever it is, they're doing it. And maybe that means I could be doing it too. And I think that brings us hope for sure. Again, it's that togetherness.
Yeah. And then I would say another tip is just to serve well, to serve others well, to get out of this relentless self-centered life. So that's that mission. I use this as mission focused or others focused living, where we get intentional about getting ourselves out of the center of every single narrative. And that usually lets hope in.
Right. Yeah. When everything doesn't have to be about me. Yes. Yeah.
And it's funny, hope is one of those things where when you're with somebody who needs it, you have it. I mean, this is an interesting thing. Like when you need it, you don't have it. You probably need to get it from somebody else. And that's where that interconnectedness really matters in our lives, and probably one of the greatest struggles of our time, to get out of isolated, spectating living and into interconnectedness. But I don't know if this is true of you, but when I'm with somebody, even if they're struggling in a similar area that I struggle in, I have a lot of hope for them. It's bizarre. I have more hope for them than I have for myself.
Yes, absolutely.
And then by the time I'm done giving them the hope that I have for them, a little of that hope
has rubbed off back on you, right? Yeah.
Yes,
yeah, exactly. I love that. That's a wonderful example. So I love your stories. I have always loved your stories. You're a gifted storyteller, which I know that I'm sure you know this, and you teach others how to tell stories well. I want to tell you a story really quick. I can't remember what summer it was, maybe 2017, 2018. And I was in Atlanta, Georgia over the 4th of July weekend. And I've been a follower and appreciative of Andy Stanley's ministry for a long, long time. And so we were going to be visiting in Atlanta, and I had talked to my family into going to North Point because I wanted to maybe hear Andy Stanley preach. And I knew Andy Stanley didn't preach every week, and so we got there, got the kids settled and all that. And my husband began to go around and investigate to find out if that was a week that Andy Stanley was preaching. And he came back to where I was sitting. He kind of had a little bit of a long face. And he said to me, Andy Stanley's not preaching today. And I'm like, okay, that's okay. We knew that would be a possibility. I still want to be here. And I said, do you know who's preaching? And he said, no, I don't know who it is. It's somebody from the Salvation Army. And I said, is it Danielle Strickland? And my husband said, I don't know. Who's Danielle Strickland? And I'm like, oh my gosh. And so then he got on social media and he was like, is this her? And I said, it is Danielle Strickland. And so he was like, I can't believe this. He said, I thought I was coming back with bad news. And I think you're happier now than if it would have been Andy Stanley. And I was just overjoyed. And during that message, you shared a story. Your message, I don't know if you remember this or not, but your message was about giving what we have where we are, basically. This is how you're a superhero. You were saying, giving the thing that we have in the place that we are. And you told a story about a woman who took cupcakes to a brothel. And I
Mhm.
have to tell you, I have retold that story in a sermon that I give,
Yeah.
giving you credit every time, of course, but I have retold that story dozens of times. And I understand that that story is in this book. And I'm wondering if you will share that story with us and maybe talk to us why it made its way into this book and what it means, what it has to say about hope for you.
Yeah, so that's awesome. That's fun. That's Jan. Jan was a retired Baptist lady. I was living in Australia at the time in Melbourne, and she lived in a suburb. She was just about a block away from a brothel, which is legalized there. So that's a common thing. And her phone number was only 2 digits different from the local brothel's phone number. So she kept getting these calls and they were disturbing her. So she decided to change her number. And on the day she was going to change her number, she was doing her devotions and God spoke to her. And she's a retired Baptist, so it was surprising. But she said, I felt God say, why are you changing your number? And I said, well, I keep getting these calls. And God said, I know, I've been sending them. And so she met with me. I was working with the Salvation Army and anti-trafficking work and justice work in that area. And actually had been trying to figure out a way to get into the legalized brothel system to see if we could help some women that needed to get out and really didn't know how. And so she told me this dilemma, told me the whole story. And she said, so what should I do? And I remember just panicking, like inside going like, I don't know what to do. Like, what's wrong with Australia? Like, why did they legalize these things? Like, oh, like
Where do we start?
Right. I'm having this internal dialogue, but instead of like sharing all that, I just asked her a couple of questions, which all Christian leaders do when they don't know what to do, just for the record. And I just said,
Stop it. You're letting out our secrets,
right. And I just asked her, what would you normally do if it wasn't like a brothel? What if it was just a neighbor that was in trouble or somebody that had an accident or someone moved into your community? Like, what would just be your natural response be? And she just right away, she said, oh, that's so easy. I would just bake some cupcakes and go and introduce myself. And I said, great, I think that's what we should do. And I remember her going, that's the strategy. And I was like, well, it is now, that's what we got. So we met on a Tuesday and she had baked all weekend. I prayed up a storm. And we walked over to this brothel. And I remember we were going, she said, you know what? The Lord really said I should do it, not you. And I remember saying to her, but like, I'm the professional. And she said, yeah, but I'm the neighbor. And I was like, oh, you got me there, right? Like you read your Bible, the neighbor always trumps the professional every single time. And but anyway, I'm like, I'm not going to let you die on my watch. So I'm going to go anyway. And I'm going to pray for you. And then you can do the door knocking yourself. But like, I'm going to be right there. So we go and I'm just literally praying the best, the hardest, the most like, fervently I've ever prayed for anybody. Please, God, don't let Jan die. And also, all the things, just like open a way. And I remember her walking up to this brothel door and knocking on the door. She's so nervous. In hindsight, I thought maybe I should have trained her a little bit in like what to say. We didn't even go over anything. And this brothel manager comes to the door because she's not the normal clientele. And he says, can I help you? And she said, I brought cupcakes, just like, and this shaky hand, this elderly lady just shoving these cupcakes. And I could see in my mind, forever etched in my mind, is this demonic spirit of sexual exploitation over Australia going like, no, not the cupcakes. Because the guy was just like, oh, cupcakes, come on in, just great. And she went to the back and she met the first 7 women and got their names and birthdays and said, come over to my house for an Australian meal. I've been a terrible neighbor. Sorry it took me so long to get here. I'd love to get to know you. And then left kind of almost levitating when it was done and said like, it worked. Like I'm a good neighbor. And I ran back to the Salvation Army headquarters, called 10 of my closest friends and said, we've got to get organized. The Baptists are going to beat us to the brothels, And they're just like, well, how are we doing it? And I said, who bakes? Do you know anyone who bakes? Like, and it turns out years later, we found out they didn't even like the cupcakes. It was an Asian brothel. They don't even like that, but it really wasn't that. It was it was the willingness. It was the decision to go and to do what you can when God prompts you to
the
do what's
decision
right
to
in front
not
of you.
change our number, whatever that means, right? To not
Right.
make whatever's happening more convenient for us. Yeah.
That's right. And to be aware of those disruptions might be coming from a holy place.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then also to just do what you can.
Yeah.
I mean, just to do what's in front of you. And a lot of times we over professionalize what's required. And that was that, even that thing about like, I'm the neighbor.
Yeah.
Like, this is my responsibility to bring some sort of offering, some sort of hope.
These
to
are the
who
people
might
somehow
be.
I'm connected with now, right? Yeah.
Right.
And so what does that have? Why this book? Why is that story in this book? What does it have to do with hope for you?
Yeah, I mean, that's what's cool about stories. And I think why Jesus chose them as the main way to communicate truth is that it could mean it for, people could see hope in that story in a whole lot of different places and a lot of different ways. So in some ways, it's like hard to explain art. You just kind of got to behold it. So in some ways, I just say, behold the story. For me, it offered hope on so many levels, like hope that retired Baptist ladies could actually make a difference in the world. Hope that it's never too late or too hard for God. Hope that, women who feel invisible could be seen. Hope that there was a way we could enter that would be less over and more under and supportive and empowering. Just so it's relentless hope on all directions for me. And just even hope of the faithfulness, that strategy of God to use the tiny things to overthrow the big things, all the time.
The hug from the lawyer, right, that came to the jail cell is the same. I see the same hope in that, in your story, Danielle, as I do for these women in the brothel, that someone baked cupcakes I didn't even like, but they baked them because they wanted to say something to them in the love of Jesus Christ. And and we do see that. We do behold that story for sure. Yeah. Tell me about, I want to ask you about Bible verses, scriptures, passages, and especially as you're communicating this message about hope, is there anything in particular that you just kind of hang on to and go back to right now?
Well, I think Romans 15:13 is a verse I memorized a couple of years ago when I was writing this book. And that's, the most obvious promise, I think, in terms of hopefulness. And it's, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him.
As you trust. I love that "as" right there in that verse. As you trust in him. Yeah, that's important.
So that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Spirit. So there's also like, we keep thinking of hope as in a scarcity mindset. But again, of course, when we stop thinking of it as a principle that we, add to our lives, and we start thinking about it as a living person who is with us and active all the time, then we think of the capacity God has to overflow with hope. I also really love Paul's idea of being a prisoner of hope. I think there's something really profound about that. I haven't completely unpacked it all the way, but I love this idea of like, I'm literally like chained to hope. And I mean, this goes deeply with I'm a slave to Christ. Like I can't, we're inseparable. I can't do this life without Jesus. And in that is hope.
Yeah, I love that. This has been fantastic. I'm just so honored for you to have spent this time with us. I want to know, before I let you go, I always ask this of all my guests before I let them go. I love to share resources. Would you let us just peek into your life a little bit right now and let us know, what are you reading, studying, listening to, watching? Anything goes that's just feeding you, maybe keeping you connected to Christ right now.
Yeah. So I'm always like, get ready. I'm always like reading like a lot of things at once and in different ways, but I've been reading Good and Beautiful and Kind by Villodas. It's beautiful. He's just a very wise leader in these times. And that book is no exception. I'm underlining half of it. I felt really led to do a deep dive into the book of Daniel, the prophet, just feeling in this season, God inviting me to think about, how to be different, how to be set apart in intentional ways, small ways. So I'm reading a theological commentary on the book of Daniel right now by a Jesuit priest named Danielle Berrigan, who I love. It's hard to get your hands on, but it's called Under the Siege of the Divine. It's amazing. And then I've been like mind-blowingly loved by reading slowly through the First Nations translation of the New Testament that just came out last week. It's an Indigenous translation, and it is so beautiful, just so fresh and different, a little different, like in terms of like the way things are said is so beautiful. And so that's really been blessing me in these days.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing those
welcome.
things with us. Yeah, I love that. And I have loved this time with you, as I've said several times. And again, I just really appreciate you for joining us. And if you would like to follow Danielle, Danielle can be found at daniellestrickland.com. Her latest book is The Other Side of Hope, Flipping the Script on Cynicism and Despair and Rediscovering Our Humanity. Her podcast is Right Side Up Podcast with Danielle Strickland. And all of that and other places you can find and follow her will be in today's show notes. So one more time, thank you so much for being with us today and serving the Steady On community.
You got it. Thank you.
And thank you, friend, for listening. Until next time, peace. How are you offering God intentional praise? It is a promise of God that He is always near, and in Him we will always find reason to hope. We find a reminder of that promise in our verse for this week, Psalm 71:14, in which the psalmist declares they will choose to place their hope in a praiseworthy God. Hear the verse again in the Amplified Bible. But as for me, I will wait and hope continually, and will praise you yet more and more. If you haven't yet, I encourage you to listen to the Take It In episode where me and my co-host Susie Crosby focus in on the word hope in this verse. A huge thank you to Danielle again for serving us with your Live It Out story. You have reminded me once again that both believing in and being the hope of the world is often as simple as baking cupcakes. Next week, world traveler and thrill seeker Ryan George will be my Live It Out guest, and our verse will be Proverbs 25:2. Ryan will talk to me about walking on the wings of airplanes and climbing ice waterfalls and meeting God in it all. If you haven't yet, I'd be so grateful if you would follow the podcast on whatever directory you're using to listen. It only takes a second, and it guarantees you'll see new episodes as soon as they drop. Thank you so much for listening. I pray wherever your day takes you, you're walking in the confident knowledge that you are a beloved, cherished child of God. Peace.